The World Health Organization approves China's COVID-19 vaccine for emergency use. Plus, in the wake of the pandemic and other challenges, top diplomats gather to discuss global cooperation. Hello, I'm Anton Fedyashin, and this is The Heat. The United Nations Security Council met in New York on Friday to discuss joint efforts to combat global challenges. We'll have more on that later in the program, but we begin with the WHO's approval of China's Sinopharm COVID-19 vaccine for emergency use, easing the way for developing countries to get access to another much-needed tool to help end the pandemic. For more, we turn now to a leading scientist and the head of Access Health International, William Haseltine. Bill, thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure, thank you.
The WHO has approved the emergency use of this vaccine, which is manufactured by Sinopharm. What does that mean? How does it change things insofar as the rollout of vaccines globally is concerned?
Well, it means that many countries will have a much easier route to obtain the vaccine and to convince their own regulatory authorities to accept it. It's a very big step forward, and it means that a lot more people will have access to vaccines, people who have not had them up to now.
Now, the WHO was acting on the advice that they were given by a panel. What kind of criteria would they have been looking at before they made this decision to approve the emergency use?
Well, the panel is called SAGE, and it's an independent panel, and the first criterion, is it effective? Do people who have been given the vaccine have less disease, either mild or serious, than those who have not received the vaccine? And the answer is yes. And the question is how effective? It's got to be greater than 50%, hopefully closer to 70% before they approve it. So that's the first step. The second has to do with safety. Is it going to be safe? Are there going to be serious adverse effects? And there too, it passed, at least in the group 18 to 60. They did comment that it needs more data for those over 60, and it needs more data on the serious adverse events on those with comorbidities. But nonetheless, they thought it was worthwhile approving it, given the current situation, for anybody 18 and above. That includes people over 60 as well.
So looking at that age breakdown, there were concerns about using the vaccine in older people, over 60.
Right, there were some concerns, but I think they were convinced that there's no reason that the absence of data, given all we know about these vaccines, means it will be less effective or more dangerous. That was their judgment.
There was a report by Bloomberg that over the past few weeks, leaders of some of the world's most populous nations have sought vaccines from China despite questions over the effectiveness. That didn't seem to concern them too much. Do you see China now becoming a primary supplier of vaccines, given that there's also a very vigorous debate going on right now in the United States for one, in Europe for another, about lifting patent rights on certain types of vaccines?
Well, I certainly hope so. The world is in dire need of more vaccines. There's a gap of several billion doses currently that isn't being met by any country. I think it's reasonable for political leaders to assure that their people have vaccines that they've developed before they ship them overseas. It would be very difficult for leaders not to do that. But we're nearing the point in many countries where there will be a surfeit of vaccines, both in the United States, in Europe, and in other countries. And I think you'll start to see other vaccines join the Sinopharm and other manufacturers. Let's take India, for example. There's an enormous need for more vaccines in India. The pharmaceutical industry and the head of some of those vaccine companies have said they can't meet up with the demand. Let's hope that some of the Sinopharm vaccines reach that market as well. It's a really serious situation there in Nepal, in regions that border right on China. So I think it's really important that this decision has been made and that the vaccines will be available.
Right, you mentioned India, where, of course, the numbers are going up every day. But it's one thing to get the vaccines into a country. It's another thing to actually get the vaccines into the arms of people, isn't it? You've got to have the necessary healthcare infrastructure for that to happen. I mean, how much does that concern people like yourself and other experts, having that kind of infrastructure to distribute the vaccine?
Health infrastructure is something I've created my foundation to address. One of the things that through my career in making discoveries, finding new drugs, bringing drugs to market, is a disappointment that not everybody has access to affordable care and affordable drugs. It's one of the great tragedies of the world, and that's really healthcare systems and policies, and we work on that. Yeah, the ability to get medicines to people who need them around the world is very uneven. But let me say something about a country you might not think has good infrastructure for that, and that's India. I've been to the most remote villages in India and found there rural healthcare facilities with high quality freezers, highly trained people, and freezers full of great vaccines for children. So there are distributions. It's not just Coca-Cola that can get to these small villages. They've managed to get their vaccine program, so they know how to do it. The question is, do they have the vaccines to get them there? And right now that answer is no, not only in that country, but in many countries. The vaccines aren't there, even if the distribution is there.
Now, another worrying factor that's we've heard about a lot is variants, that there's lots of variants right now. This virus is constantly mutating. What do we know about these variants, and will these vaccines be effective against the variants as they are against the original virus?
Well, let me say there are differences amongst vaccines and there are differences amongst variants. So it really depends on the match between the vaccine and the variant. And sometimes it's excellent, and sometimes it leaves something to be desired. And that really depends where you are in the world and what variants you're dealing with. I can say something about what's happening in India at the moment, and that is there are many people who've been fully vaccinated who are still getting infected. Some of them are getting mildly sick. The good news is there are fewer people getting very ill and dying, even though they're getting infected. We would like the vaccine to stop infections, but we're certainly happy that it is preventing death. So even though it may not prevent infections in all cases, it may have a dramatic modulating effect on how serious that infection is. So even if it's not as good as you would hope, it still has a lot of utility. And I think that's one of the decisions that was behind the thinking of the WHO with Sinopharm.
Professor William Heseltine, thanks so much for joining us, sir.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
Now, as I mentioned earlier, the United Nations Security Council met on Friday. The virtual gathering, which was chaired by the Chinese State Councilor and Foreign Minister Wang, sought to reaffirm support for multilateralism, nations working together, and to promote a greater role for the UN in international affairs. Liling Tan has more in this report.
Now, this high-level session was hosted by China to discuss multilateralism and find ways to update and improve international cooperation. But because this was a meeting hosted by China and this was the second interaction between China's State Councilor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi and U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken since their contentious Alaska meeting, a lot of the attention here was focused on how that dynamic between China and the U.S. would play out in this virtual Security Council meeting. Now, the good news from the diplomatic point of view is that this was considerably more civil than what played out in Alaska. But still, there was criticism, veiled criticism, directed by each side at the other. Have a listen.
International rules must be based on international law and must be written by all. They are not a patent or a privilege of the few. They must be applicable to all countries, and there should be no room for exceptionalism or double standards.
Asserting domestic jurisdiction doesn't give any state a blank check to enslave, torture, disappear, ethnically cleanse their people, or violate their human rights in any other way.
The U.S. is among countries that have accused China of violating human rights in its Xinjiang region, with some nations alleging that China's actions there amount to genocide. Now, China has strongly denied this and said the West, and especially the U.S., concocted and disseminated false information, and that the Xinjiang issue isn't one about human rights, nor ethnicity, nor religion, but about combating terrorism and separatism. Now, China, in turn, has also accused the U.S. of exercising what it calls long-arm jurisdiction and of causing humanitarian disasters through its military interventions. Now, all of these accusations are not entirely new, but they are happening in a context where China has been growing its participation and involvement at the United Nations, as well as its influence around the world. And while the Biden administration is trying to repair America's international reputation and re-exert itself on the global stage. So it is important to bear in mind that this is happening in that geopolitical context, even though it's taking place under this collective promise of multilateral cooperation. Now, despite these differences, there were areas where both countries found common ground. For example, the acknowledgement that there was a need for more cooperation to address the immediate threat of the COVID-19 pandemic, and also the longer-term existential threat posed by climate change. Li Lingtan, CGTN, New York.
Well, there is much to talk about. Let's get to our panel. Anton Fedyashin is a professor at American University. He focuses on Russian and European history. Klaus Larres is a distinguished professor of history and international affairs at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He previously served as a counselor and senior policy advisor at the German embassy in Beijing. Joel Rubin is a national security analyst. He served as a deputy assistant secretary of state in the Obama administration. And Victor Gao is a current affairs commentator and a chair professor at Soochow University. Thank you, everyone, for being with us. Victor, before we get to the goings-on at the UN, first, your response, very briefly, to that WHO decision to authorize the Sinopharm vaccine.
Well, first of all, the WHO decision to recognize the Sinopharm vaccine is a very important step. I have received 2 shots of the Sinopharm vaccine, and I felt great. There have been more than 200 million shots being distributed and people being inoculated in China. And Sinopharm vaccine has been proven effective as well as safe. So this authorization gives the chance to hundreds of millions of people in many other parts of the world, including developing countries, but also developed countries, to receive the vaccine at a very critical time when we see major surges in cases in, for example, countries like India. So this is great news. Let's congratulate WHO's right decision, and let's make sure that as many people as possible get vaccinated.
Okay, Victor, let's move on to the gathering at the United Nations. The Chinese Foreign Minister Wang chaired that Security Council meeting on multilateralism. And I'm wondering, what does that mean in this day and age? Because we know that most countries always, or many countries, act in their own interests. So does this meeting change that notion in any way?
No, I think in the world of today, multilateralism headed by the United Nations system should be the megatrend. And no country should be an exception to that. No country should be allowed to put itself on top of many other countries and pretend to be the ruler or the superior species above the rest of mankind. And I think multilateralism under the international order as we understand it is the right thing, because it ensures that every country, big or small, stronger or weaker, should be treated equal. And I think China is very much in support of multilateralism, especially in cases headed by the United Nations. And we hope all the other countries, especially the other permanent member states of the Security Council of the United Nations, would do the same, rather than pretend to be major exception to the multilateralism headed by the United Nations.
Joel Rubin, the former president of the United States, Donald Trump, he rejected what he termed the ideology of globalism. He said that the United States would not surrender its sovereignty to what he termed, and I'm quoting here, unaccountable, unelected global bureaucracies. The current Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, has talked about this at the UN. Let's listen to what he had to say.
I know that some of our actions in recent years have undermined the rules-based order and led others to question whether we are still committed to it. Rather than take our word for it, we ask the world to judge our commitment by our actions. Under the Biden-Harris administration, The United States has already re-engaged vigorously in multilateral institutions. We've rejoined the Paris Climate Accord, recommitted to the World Health Organization, and we're seeking to rejoin the Human Rights Council.
So, Joel, listening there to Antony Blinken, implicit in that answer seems to be an admission there that the United States lost some of its international influence under the Trump administration and is now trying to regain that influence. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, Anand, it completely is. I think what Secretary Blinken is making very abundantly clear is that we in the United States view multilateralism as an advantage for the world and for the United States in terms of our interest and our values and promoting those around the world. And Tony Blinken in particular, he has been the right hand of President Biden for many years, and they're very aggressive about talking about democracy and human rights and how Donald Trump really abandoned those values and those principles on the international stage. And we saw Donald Trump rejected soundly in the election and with a very different vision for America's role in the world. And I think we're seeing already the benefits of multilateralism for the United States in terms of engaging the world on issues like climate change, engaging the world on the vaccine distribution and attempting to partner with the World Health Organization as an example. These are value-added engagements, and for Secretary Blinken, it is he's making it clear that we in the United States are not perfect, but because of our democracy, we're able to self-reflect, push out governments, and the American people voted one out, and restore a position, certainly in this administration, that values multilateralism and global engagement.
Klaus, Larres, under the Trump administration, the United States pulled out of the Paris Climate Accord, as we've just heard. It also pulled out of that nuclear deal with other countries involving Iran, the JCPOA as it's known. And not just that, the Trump administration and the United States at that time had a very abrasive relationship with key European allies. And I was wondering, to what extent, how serious was that damage? And is there a feeling in Europe right now that the United States can't be relied on automatically all the time?
Yeah, everyone was relieved when Trump was not re-elected. It was clear that with any progress regarding transatlantic relations with the Trump administration would have been impossible. So people were frightened that 4 more terrible years would follow. So when Biden was elected, there was a huge applause, huge relief in Europe. However, it has become clear that Joe Biden is following something like a hybrid foreign policy. He is very tough on Russia and China, but at the same time, he also reaches out to both China and Russia. And sometimes the Europeans feel that perhaps that toughness, that cause of confrontation is perhaps overdone, while cooperation is not strongly enough pushed. But on the whole, I think the Europeans are siding with the Biden administration. They feel that transatlantic relations have been renewed, have been rejuvenated, and there's still huge relief that Joe Biden and not Donald Trump is in the White House. However, problems have come up in the recent past, and that particularly applies also with Germany. Actually, there was a paper newsletter or a headline in a newspaper, in a German newspaper today, which said, "Is there a new German problem? Does the White House think there is a new German problem?" Because the Germans are hesitant regarding Nord Stream 2 to give in to American pressure to give up on the pipeline between Russia and Germany called Nord Stream 2. There's also now trouble about intellectual property rights waiver, which Biden is pushing regarding vaccines. Only today at the EU summit in Porto, that has been very controversial. And also relations with China. The EU feel that perhaps better economic relations with China are still the way to go, rather than being too tough on China.
Anton Fedyashin, the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, he was at the Security Council meeting, well, it was a virtual meeting. He told the Council that this is his words, he said that the architecture of global governance created after World War II is being sorely tested. He said, and I'm quoting here again, "Unfortunately, not all of our partners are guided by the imperative of working honestly to establish genuine multilateral cooperation." Was this a sort of veiled jab at the United States here?
Oh, definitely. He actually says something even stronger on today. He accused the United States of imposing totalitarianism in international affairs. And when I speak to Russian specialists, they point to the usual list of rules of the international order that the United States and its allies have broken. That would be the invasion of Iraq. That would be the forceful partitioning of Serbia and the creation of Kosovo, which not even the United States allies, some of them, in Europe have recognized because they refuse to recognize legitimacy of that state. It's the invasion of Libya. There are plenty of grievances that you hear coming out of Russia against the U.S. So this narrative that comes out of Washington about respecting the rules-based international order, the Russians see as a unilateral imposition of rules that the U.S. and its allies can break when it suits their interests, but expect everyone else to follow. Let me just say very quickly two more things. It's very interesting. You played that piece by Antony Blinken, and listen, it's a clear and fairly successful strategy that he's using in sort of suggesting that the rules-based international order was broken by Donald Trump, but not by his predecessors, whereas I just gave you a list of things that went against international law and preceded Donald Trump. He added to that, but he's certainly not the only one. Listen, the United States has always protected its sovereignty and placed it above all else. It's never given up on its sovereignty. And, we stand to see how this noble desire to return to a multilateral policy on the part of the U.S. Will work. So far, there's not much to say for it. One last thing, Joel mentioned vaccines and the importance of the U.S. for that. Listen, I agree with that completely, but the Health and Human Services just released a report in January of this year in which it noted that it put pressure on the Brazilian government to refuse the Russian Sputnik vaccine. Doesn't sound like a multilateral, policy there.
Okay, Joel, let me get a quick response.
I mean, that last one was the Trump administration, which goes exactly to my point. But going to these other issues of multilateralism, this is just, we have a term here. It's called gaslighting. It's essentially saying, well, the United States did these bad things, which, by the way, the invasion of Iraq, which I oppose, was sanctioned by the United Nations, and there was on Libya, which again, a very disastrous situation on Libya. Nonetheless, the Arab League voted to ask for assistance in that. So Russia's invasion of Ukraine was not blessed by any multilateral institution. So I think we need to be a little clear on what we're talking about here, where Foreign Minister Lavrov is entitled to complain about the United States all he wants, but he can't misplace the facts about Russia's behavior across Ukraine in particular. And I think that this is sort of a moment, and this is the bigger picture point, then we can debate all we want about the particulars. The big moment is that Joe Biden is reasserting the language of American engagement, diplomacy, and democracy, and that is certainly unsettling to many of our competitors.
Okay, I want to get to Victor. Victor, we were talking about the veiled jab that Sergei Lavrov may have made at the United States, but the U.S. Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, made his own veiled reference. Let's listen to this.
The United Nations is based on the principle of the sovereign equality of its member states. A state does not respect that principle when it purports to redraw the borders of another, or seeks to resolve territorial disputes by using or threatening force, or when a state claims it's entitled to a sphere of influence to dictate or coerce the choices and decisions of another country. When UN member states, particularly permanent members of the Security Council, flout these rules and block attempts to hold accountable those who violate international law, it sends the message that others can break those rules with impunity. All of us must accept the scrutiny, however difficult, that comes with the commitments we freely made.
What do you make of the Secretary's comments, Victor?
Well, first of all, other things being equal, I think Tony Blinken's statement is correct and is very reasonable. I hope it will be of having a lasting impact on the U.S. policy. However, the danger is Trumpism in the United States is not dead. It's still alive and kicking. And the midterm election is coming up very soon. And Trump has been talking about entering into presidential re-election, for example, in 2024. So we do not know what will happen to the United States. One word of caution is that the United States actually need to recognize that the worst enemy of the United States is actually the United States itself. It needs to really put a lid and stop racism and white supremacism, for example, all kinds of prejudices in the United States, because this really does not reflect well on the democracy or the human rights in the United States, and this prevents the United States from really becoming the shining light on the top of the mountain to engage with the rest of the world.
Klaus, I've just got a little bit of time left, but I'm going to address this, and this is the question of sanctions. The Chinese foreign minister talked of sanctions, which, as we are fully aware, are a popular tool used by mainly the nations of the West. Here's what Foreign Minister Wang had to say. Let's listen.
Sanctions and other enforcement measures should be used only after all other non-enforcement means are exhausted and for the purpose of seeking political settlement. All unilateral moves that circumvent the Security Council are illegitimate and must be abandoned.
Does the minister have a point there, Klaus? Because if we look at the manner in which sanctions have been imposed, if you just look at recent sanctions that were imposed against Venezuela, for instance, or the sanctions that have been continually imposed against Iran, we see that there is enormous suffering that it causes among the civilian populations there.
I quite agree. I mean, sanctions have been overused, and they have been much more used also in U.S. foreign policy than in the past. But you also have to look at the EU and China. Both sides have imposed sanctions on each other. I think all the major players in the world, including China and the EU, are actually guilty of making much too much use of sanctions. The foreign minister is quite right. They should be an instrument of last resort. First, negotiations should be entered into. But I would just also like to add to the previous discussion. I think we don't know, of course, whether or not Trump or someone like him will be back. And that is the reason we have a window of opportunity now with Joe Biden in the White House. I think his genuine interest in cooperation with everyone, the transatlantic alliance, but also with China, cannot be doubted. Therefore, I think we should all try to make use of that, because that window of opportunity may go away in a few years' time. So I think all the great powers should really get their act together and try to embark on a more cooperative attitude, be it in the United Nations or elsewhere.
Okay, and I am sorry that we have to leave it there. Time has caught up with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.